Now, for this last episode of season 3, as I asked God, how do I close out this particular season? What I heard was that it was time to share more of my full story. Now, if you've been listening for some time or if you've read my book, you've probably heard a good portion. But I'm going to go a little deeper than I've ever gone before because I believe that we overcome by the power of our testimony. I also believe that, God has brought me too far for me to not give him the glory and let the world know how faithful and loving he is in the midst of both the good and the bad times. And my hope for you is that you realize that he can do the same for you. He can do it for your daughter. He can do it for your niece. He could do it for your uncle. He could do it for your brother or whoever that person is that you are praying for. And I think it's also very important, but I also think it's important that we just take time to unpack our story, which, I did talk about in episode 7. The reason that I know this is so true because I wholeheartedly believe that all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. I believe that we all are a written epistle, and it's important for you to know how the pieces of your life fit together and where you can look for evidence of how God's hand has been on your life over your lifetime. Our stories are our blueprint to our calling. If you really want to know how to move forward in life, first look up, then look back, because the answers are there. And with that being said, I do know that it's hard for many people to speak about the highs and the lows of what you've gone through. It's not easy to process your life experiences and uncover how they've influenced your heart or your mind, your general well-being. So listen, don't feel pressure to tell your story. It's your story to share, when you're ready. But I will say that by the grace of God, I've gone through so much healing, deliverance, transformation. And, even as a therapist, I was blessed to be exposed to so much knowledge and wisdom that provided me with the tools to work through my own issues, even as I was helping other people. And I've just gone through so much healing with even the people that are part of my story. So it makes it a little bit easier for me to share. My prayer is that you too will get to that place. It's been a long process of getting to this point of being able to understand and embrace the journey that God has taken me on. But now, I not only embrace it, but I celebrate it. And I want to celebrate your story with you as well. I believe that there is beauty that has come from the ashes of your life. I believe that the hand of God has brought you through storm after storm after storm after storm. I believe you are an overcomer whose past has created this space for healing in not just your life, but someone else's life as well who's going through the exact same thing. I just want to encourage you to find the message in your story. Find the ways that God has been present and active throughout your story. Who are the people that he used? What are the experiences that had impact on you? Find out what happened to your voice over the years. What caused you to lose it? What caused you to have that passion? Where are your views on life actually coming from? And again, even if you're not comfortable with sharing, at least feel empowered to use it to help you explore the path that God has put you on. And let me say this, listen, you don't need a lot of drama or highs and lows for your story to have meaning. The purpose of sharing, it's not to compare. It's to testify of God's goodness, of his hand on your life, all right? So I know a lot of people who have, they'll say, well, I've had very little of what you might call like major events and changes in my life. And so I don't really see it as a testimony. But I also think that often the parts of our story where God does some of his greatest work, it's not always tied to a major event. So don't let anything silence your your voice or your story. There is something powerful that God wants to do through it. Now, I'll just start by saying, my story, it's a story of love, of pain, of joy, sadness. It's a story of family and relationships, of being forgotten, but also being chosen. It's full of twists and turns, hope and despair, grace and a lot of mercy. It's my story. I believe it's the story of the human experience. It's beautiful but complicated. I was born to two young but very vibrant and passionate parents who were in their early 20s. They had my brother just 2 years prior, and before I arrived, my parents, they had just dealt with their fair share of trauma. A few years before I was born, my dad tragically lost his loved and well-respected father to murder. My mom, she had gone through quite a bit of trauma as a child and adolescent that impacted her in many ways. So I came into the picture 3 days before my dad's birthday, and so I was like his birthday gift, right? He and I had this very close bond. He was the nurturing parent, the hugger, the encourager, the one that would expose me to the beauties of nature and karate, Girl Scouts, just kind of emphasize the importance of family and having a routine. My mom, she was the constant in my life. No matter what was going on, she encouraged me to be bold and courageous, to be a leader, to use my voice, to be expressive and creative. She's the one who ensured I learned how to make money in elementary school. That person who was selling candy to your kids in elementary school, that was me, right? Like, I was the one that started a business in elementary school. But I learned, how to value independence and make money fairly early on. I dealt with the typical things kids go through in families. There were differences in how I was treated by various family members, right? Of course, there was sibling rivalry, although, there were times my brother and I were actually pretty close. But despite those things, I had a pretty close-knit family. We spent time together for birthdays and holidays. We supported each other when there were events or things to celebrate. I was a pretty good student. I was very active and involved, other than having like a smart mouth here and there. I had a good relationship with most of my teachers. I was president of several clubs in school. Life was good. Well, at least that was the story I told myself, was the story of my childhood. And while those things are all true, I, for a long time, thought that life was perfect, that even after I grew up and looked back, I looked at that period of my life and always thought that it wasn't until I was about 12 years old that everything began to change. But I later embraced the fact that although I was blessed to attend the same elementary school until graduation, the reality is there was quite a bit of instability because our family, we moved around a lot. My dad was in and out of the home because he was overcoming a drug addiction, which took him several years to overcome. My mom did her best to support him and to care for the two of us while working and eventually going back to school. But we lived in some pretty tough places in Baltimore. I had to know how to fight. Even though I hated hurting people, but there was always one girl who would find a reason to want to fight me. It was always interesting. So, it's interesting that I thought moving frequently and maybe having a parent with an addiction was normal. It wasn't until later when I unpacked my own attachment style and my difficulty with staying in one place for too long that I realized how much that period of my life actually impacted me. But overall, because of family and consistency in school, I had a good foundation to start with. But then everything changed. Two major life events happened when I turned 11, and that's my parents divorced, and then I was separated from my community, which was the constant in my life, and I was sent to private school. Now, I'll summarize the next 7 years that happened by saying this is when I became acquainted with issues of abandonment, rejection, inferiority, depression, anxiety, classism, racism, anger. The list goes on. My dad, he chose to abandon us out of frustration with my mom. That was how he processed his emotions at that time. So I now lost the one who would give me a sense of identity and acceptance acceptance and love. I'm then sent to a place where I would be one of the few minorities, not just in race, but also in socioeconomic status, right? So this girl that was a leader, that was fearless, that was bold, that was courageous, I froze, I froze and I began to disappear. I went from being this bold, outspoken leader to the person that just felt unseen, unwanted, and just inadequate. And, while both my parents were coping with their pain and the sudden changes to their life that they had to face, I was left to figure out how to navigate all the changes in my life and the emotions that came with them. So I did what any pre-adolescent would do. I shut down all emotions, I became numb internally. I just went on autopilot. I would subconsciously then begin to choose, okay, I'm going to do what people around me are doing. And that was just to live a double life. I was a good enough student. I was great at sports. I had a few friends. But by 8th grade, I was regularly looking forward to that weekend pint of gin and marijuana to escape from the feelings and the emotions and the realities of my life. And this would be the beginning of like a 10-year relationship with alcohol dependence and occasional drug use to numb and escape from the realities of life that I had no idea how to confront. Going into high school, I lost all sense of value in myself. So being promiscuous was a natural thing to add. My adolescent brain, I convinced myself that I was in control because I was choosing freedom to do the things that helped me escape. I didn't know how to say it back then, but that was ultimately what I felt. Now, I mentioned that I was living this double life, but that doesn't mean that no one knew what I was doing. One issue that I always had since I was a little girl was the inability to carry guilt. So whenever I would do something, especially at a young age, I would tell on myself. I also knew, the punishment would be less if I said something, but ultimately my conscience just couldn't bear what was happening until I actually said it, until I confessed. Well, what happened is that part of my conscience, it was silenced after a certain point, especially shortly after I ended up pregnant at age 15 with my long-term boyfriend. And, that decision to have an abortion, the one that I regret even to this day, that shifted something in me. It took me from not just not feeling, but just completely just disconnecting. And I thank God that, He has freed me from the guilt and the condemnation that I carried for so many years because of that decision. But back then, in my mind, that was the only option. I attended this great school. It was expected that I would go to college. So just having a child was not an option. Now, let me just, again, I really got to pause for a second and say that I thank God that He is merciful and compassionate. There are often things that we do from a place of pain, selfishness, ignorance, or fear, and He does not condemn us. So it's always baffling to me that there is a such thing as a judgmental Christian, because of all the mercy that He's shown each and every one of us. But let me get back to the story. So fast forward, I'm a senior. I really don't have too many close relationships because I always hung out with the older kids, and then of course they eventually graduated. The school that I attended went from elementary to high school, so I was there middle and high school. But once they all graduated, most of my time was spent with the person that I was in a relationship with, right? And so I was just always doing my own thing. I did have, a small friend group, and because I was a natural leader, there were people that would just kind of follow me, but there was no intimacy in my relationships. I just kept most people at a distance. Then another shift happened in my life, and I was required to do a senior project. And so through a family connection, I was able to intern for a company that was heavily involved in the music industry in the DMV area. And this was an amazing opportunity. I was able to be around celebrities, hang out in VIP sections of clubs. Even at age 17, I learned a lot about business. I did such a good job as an intern that I was offered a full-time position to continue working over the summer until I would leave for college in Atlanta that fall. Well, as you might imagine, working in the industry, there were many things that I was exposed to, but also protected from. But that exposure, it planted seeds in me that would later germinate when I would get to Atlanta. So I'll come back to that. But shortly after my 18th birthday, I would find myself in a relationship with the CEO of that company me, which would go on for at least the next year. And the idea of being 18 in a relationship with someone in their mid-30s, that felt normal to me. I was very mature for my age. I had navigated a lot of difficult situations, and like this false sense of confidence that I relied on told me that I could handle anything. So we would travel together to different cities for events and even just for vacation. For me, this was the redemption I was due for the previous 7 years of rejection and feelings of inadequacy. I felt like I was finally seen and appreciated. It wasn't until later when I understood concepts like grooming and the impact of having daddy issues that I could reconcile that this experience was not genuine. Now, as I'm sharing these things, I want you to know that when you share your story, you are putting the devil to shame, because he wants us to hide our past and carry all this shame inside of us, all this fear. But that is not what God has for you. God wants you to be set free in every area of your life. But I want you to think about how, for me, my ability to look at someone who would come into my office burdened with shame and guilt and just feel no judgment towards them, but only compassion. There is a reason for that. There were things that I had to go through. There is a reason why you have compassion for certain people and you have a heart and a burden to help people with certain situations. And hopefully you can see that this is not about blaming anyone for what I went through in life. Hurt people hurt people. And the fact is that yes, a lot of choices were made that impacted my life that I had no control over. But then there was also a point where I began to make choices, and that led me down a path of destruction. So we also have to own the fact that we made choices even when we had no idea what we were choosing. So now, once I left for Atlanta, right, it was just on and popping, right? I'm out of my hometown. I'm truly independent. I have all the music connections. So what do you think happened next, right? I went to school for my freshman year, and I was completely bored out of my mind. It was a great school, but because the school I attended was so advanced, I wasn't really being challenged, so I did meet some great professors and picked up some things from especially my freshman business seminar that I still use with people to this day. But after that first year, I dropped out. I thought, like, why am I wasting my time in school when I could be making a lot of money? That little bit of coin that I made while working in the music industry, it made me feel like I was onto something, that I was making a lot of money. It was not a lot of money, so I dropped out. I found an apartment. Then I got a job, and I decided to stay in Atlanta. And my mom, she was always very supportive of me as I made various decisions. So that made things much easier for me to go after what I believed was best. And so now I'm doing my thing in Atlanta. I was great at networking, so I made a lot of connections pretty quickly. So then those seeds that were planted and watered while I was doing my internship, they began to manifest shortly after I started working. And before you know it, I found myself in a 2-year relationship with a female I met online. How did this happen? Well, this is why I'm so passionate about understanding spiritual things, because the enemy is always looking for ways to steal, kill, or destroy your destiny. I had no idea that I was being influenced. To me, I was living my best life. And one of the things that I'm truly grateful for is that I had a praying mother who, once she discovered the lifestyle I was living, she didn't judge me, but she called it out for what it was, and she prayed for me. And one thing that I didn't mention is that I was introduced to God at a young age. I was saved and baptized at age 8. I attended church on and off until about age 12. So I had a strong enough foundation that God could lean on, could use to stir something up in me, even as I was going through this wilderness experience in Atlanta. I'm also grateful that I had not just a mom, but a grandmother, an aunt, uncle, and just other people in my life that would encourage me in my faith and always would just encourage me to attend church. So even when I first got there, when I was in college, my freshman year, on the weekends that I did not go out, I would always try to take the shuttle and go to church, right? And so there was always something pulling me, and I didn't know what it was, but I would go. And so these things would continue as I'm living this double life. Well, one thing that God had been showing me now that I'm in this relationship and I'm thinking that this is just part of who I am, he began to show me that I was completely out of his will. And I had no idea, but that's what was happening. I would begin to have these night terrors, and there was just always this constant feeling of something's not right, something is off, right? And it's hard because when you're so deep into something, it just becomes a part of you. It truly takes the hand of God to remove you from those dark places. That's why I encourage everyone to always use wisdom when you're ministering to people who are living in sin, because it requires God's intervention and his mercy to pull them from that place. But one thing that I will say about God is that he will go to the depths of hell to pull you out from any dark place that you have gone through. You know, his love is not tidy. It's not conditional. It doesn't require you to have anything together. You know, he will come to the club, the bedroom, wherever you are, and redeem you from a path of destruction. There is a reason why I call him my rescuer. But let me not jump ahead. So once I came out of that situation, God began opening and closing some doors in my life, which led to me going back to school. And somewhere between having, you know, a mom who was constantly talking about purpose and two parents who just were very community oriented and were always helping people, and then, you know, just kind of seeing them struggle with their own mental health issues and issues with money, I knew I wanted to, you know, help people. There was a sense of I'm supposed to help people, but I was still very much the money motivated person from elementary school, right? So my mom suggested, you know, I go into social work, but go the administrative route, the policy route. So that's what I did. And what that did was it led me down a path of connecting with people who would then lead me into a personal relationship with Jesus. It opened the door for me to begin to be in alignment with God's plan for my life. And I'm going to fast forward to the end of my 7-year journey in Atlanta, right before I was going to leave for grad school. But there was this shift that happened in me whereby I had this conviction that God, he had so much more for me. I remember that year, you know, I went to this house party, did all the things I would usually do. And when I left, I just felt like enough is enough. Like I was so tired of going in circles and doing the same things over and over again. And it was interesting because it was like God, he allowed that to happen because of something that he was about to do in my life. Because that same week, my coworker invited me to join her and her church on a fast, a 21-day fast, something I had never fasted before in my life, right? And that is when my life completely began to shift. During that fast, you know, I began to hear God's voice clearly. I knew that the deliverance that I was praying for, that I had received it. God told me that he wanted me to return back to Maryland for my master's program, which was far from what I thought was going to happen. My plan was always to go to New York and to do my master's there. So all these things just began to shift suddenly. And 2 months after that, I met my now husband, who was a man, a God-fearing man who lived a complete opposite lifestyle from what I had experienced, but who was able to demonstrate the love and acceptance and compassion that I had not experienced in a long time. You know, I always talk about allowing God to work on you because there are people that he wants to connect you to, but there are some things that you cannot take with you into those relationships or the relationship will not last. The process of renewing my mind, that's when it really started to begin, which you would think that what would come next is, oh, everything would be great. I'm now walking with God. Absolutely not. It was not great. It was terrible. It was hard, right? But it was all necessary. You know, God would spend at least the next 10 years doing surgery on my heart, my mind, and my spirit to heal, to restore, to set free, and deliver me from all the things that I had become and done from a place of pain and brokenness. He would bring me to the end of myself to let go of of the identity issues, the lack of confidence, the mindset that was rooted in man and survival. He would show me the value of serving others and giving of oneself and one's resources to the building of the kingdom. During this time, there were so many obstacles and challenges that would arise, but I later understood that this was all part of the process of me learning how to trust him and how to rely on his tools to navigate life instead of the ones that I would usually rely on, right? So his toolbox was full of things like patience, love, mercy, forgiveness, meekness, kindness, wisdom, understanding, long suffering. Let's call his toolbox grace. And it's definitely lighter than the toolbox the world gives you, but it has a greater impact. And there's so much more that I can talk about, but if I could just summarize that next chapter that I entered, I would just say that I am so grateful that he allowed me to marry an amazing man of God who had the right amount of stubbornness to stick with me through my transformation process. God helped us to press beyond the challenges that every marriage goes through, especially the first 5 years, right? That first 5-year hump, to now being able to truly enjoy our marriage and help others to do the same. Whether he helped us and was with us through the many miscarriages and the life-threatening pregnancy and just the many things that we've had to go through, but he's shown us how to trust his process, that there is, a peace, a joy, and a level of faith that no circumstance can take away when we are with him, when we know that he is with us. Through all of that, through all of the pain, through all of the transformation, through all of the surgery, there was a fire that he has given me, that there a calling that I can use to be able to help others, all to his glory, who are going through or dealing with some of the same circumstances. There are so many things that I didn't say because of time, that I'm open and I'm willing to share. But I truly, I appreciate you listening to even this portion of my story. And again, my prayer is that you will see that there is nothing about your life that God will not use. Now, I do want to point out that I just spent most of my time sharing the major events, right? And things that really affected the path that I was on. And if I had time, I would talk about all the sports coaches that were a source of encouragement, the family members who were constantly praying for me, the many times, God called me out to expose me to something that would also shift my perspective in amazing ways, or the many moments where I could see his hand on my life, even though I tried to always be behind the wheel. There were many great moments in my story as well, which they matter just as much as the hard times. But ultimately, why am I telling you all of this? Because when I spend my time telling you that God's grace is sufficient, that there is nothing that you can do or that you have gone through that he cannot redeem you from, or that he cannot heal, it is not a theory for me. More parts to the story will be shared in time that I believe will really help some people. But my goal, it really isn't to focus on my life, but more so to use my testimony as a source of encouragement to you. It's not a coincidence that I work well with people who are publicly successful, but privately in pain. I witnessed it, and I also was that person. It's not a coincidence that God has called me to help people overcome their mental health and spiritual challenges so that they can be whole, or to help teen girls who have identity issues and are dealing with teen pregnancy. I can go on, but listen, I mentioned the compassion that he has allowed me to have for people. It was not always that way. Because growing up, I had to be tough. There was not much mercy for me, so I didn't have much for other people. It wasn't until he took me through a process. He had to tear down those walls. He had to free me of some things so that I could truly see how much mercy he has shown me, and to realize that I cannot expect something from him that I am not willing to show others myself. Listen, mercy went from being at the bottom of my spiritual gifts test to being in the top 5. But those who are forgiven much love much. all things work together for your good. God has not wasted one experience that I've gone through, and He will not waste any experience that you have gone through. Let's just stop living and being on autopilot and existing with the pain. God wants you to be whole. I promise that if you allow Him to be your Lord, if you truly yield to His leading and His hand on your life, that you will not recognize the person that you will become. Who you see today, who you are listening to today, is a testimony of His love, His mercy, and His grace. And guess what? It's not over. Alrighty, you know what time it is. This is the time where we get to discuss a phrase, pattern, or belief that has been a hindrance to many in the culture. And if we eradicate it, it will improve your life, your family, and the community. It's chain breaking time. The behavior pattern that we are addressing this week is judging others when they make mistakes. How often are we looking at others and drawing conclusions about who they are, about why they're doing what they're doing, simply because they made a mistake? Here's the thing. We all fall short. We all are going to mess up at some point in time. None of us are in a position to sit in the seat of judgment. God desires for us to love people through their mistakes, to pray for them, to support them, to encourage them, to lift them up from that place. Judgment only pushes people further into whatever it is that they're doing. Let's elevate with love. It is the goodness of God that leads to repentance, not you having an opinion, not you being judgmental, not you gossiping about what they're doing. It is love. If you really want to make a difference, if you really want to help people to change, do it with love and not judgment. But until next time, shalom.